phone doesn't work? Oh, there we go. Ladies and gentlemen, thanks for staying with us again. As I mentioned before, now we're going to focus on Brazil, and I would like to introduce to you our guests. We have Carlos Pio, Executive Secretary of CAMEX-Board of Trade and Investment, Ministry of Economy of Brazil. Thank you very much for joining us. Wilson Poit, Endeavor Entrepreneur and Board Member, Focus Energia Brazil. Did I say that right?
Yes.
Yes. And Alexandre Baulé, Founder and Chief Executive Officer of BPAR in Brazil. Gentlemen, thank you very much for joining us. It is quite interesting what has happened to Brazil after more than a decade of leftist governments. All of a sudden, voters in Brazil say that again?
2 decades.
2 decades. 2 decades. Voters say, okay, this is it. We're going to go to the other side. And instead of me doing the explanation, I would like to start with you, Mr. Minister, because it's a very interesting phenomenon how the political pendulum took a swing extremely to the other side. So what happened in Brazil? How do you explain the victory of Jair Bolsonaro?
I think that we have to take into account that the country was under a very deep recession that was caused mostly by the failure of government policies that had been tried not 20 years before, but 50 or 60 years before. So I don't know whether we can agree that Brazil was under left-wing governments only for 20 years. I think it's much longer. If we consider the nationalists and the more structuralist approach to policy, that the government has to actually intervene, tell who should produce what, when, how, for what price, and sell to whom. So we've been doing these policies that in Latin America we know as import substitution industrialization.
Was it pure populism?
It was not. And I have to tell you that, you know, back in the days, in the 40s and 50s, there was a big debate whether government should get involved and how they should get involved. Liberalism versus all the other isms was something real. But the economic history of the second half of the 20th century shows clearly that the more the government gets involved in very complex tasks, in political systems that are still in the process of becoming more democratic, more republican, this is an open avenue for corruption. So there were populists, there still are, but it's not only populism. Let's say that Brazilian history with interventionist policies was very successful until the crisis of the 1970s. And that's in the mindset of the population and economists, academics, journalists. So we have a very clear challenge to change this mindset in Brazil. And I think that Jair Bolsonaro's approach, especially the minister, Paulo Guedes in the economy ministry, yes, is one that pushes in, for that change. It says, you know, you have to work harder, you have to work better, and you are in charge of your own life, your companies, and the result is a country that will maybe become more productive. So it's a clash of ideas, I would say.
But I remember going to Brazil in 2011, 2012, and I remember that people were talking about programs like Bolsa Familia, a welfare program for those of you who are not that involved or knowledgeable in Brazil. And the government line was, hey, we're taking people out of poverty. This is working great. It is going to redevelop many of our neighborhoods. But I want to go to you, Alexandre. Was that all a facade and these programs were not really working? It was just like a temporary uptick in the economy and not really something that could be sustainable?
I think it was the first step. The point is, if somebody is starving, it's good that you give food. But then you get to give this guy the opportunity to grow his own food, to make his own living. The problem with welfare, it can be vicious. You can get addicted to that.
Don't give them fish, teach them how to fish.
Yes, because the point is long term, somebody should pay for that. If everybody is on welfare, who is going to sustain welfare? The point is how you can get everybody committed to do work, meaningful work, creating value to the society that will sustain permanently or temporarily the ones that cannot make their own living.
Were those years of leftist governments for you in the private sector difficult? Was it difficult to navigate? Was it difficult to create opportunities?
I wouldn't say really leftist government. The point is the government in general in Brazil overdid on regulation and on intrusion on the business. So yes, life is very hard to comply with all the tax nightmarish system we have in Brazil.
A lot of bureaucracy.
Lots of bureaucracy. So that really drains a lot of energy from the entrepreneurs to produce value that will sustain the welfare and the whole stuff. That didn't really change from the right, so-called right governments and left governments.
Right.
The point is very well taken. I couldn't agree more. Is the fact that everybody starts to be responsible for what they do, have as much as possible less and simpler regulation to show what is the right track and the wrong track. Be accountable for that, because accountability is another problem. We have very beautiful laws, but when you go over the law, nothing happens.
Compliance, yes, compliance.
Now it's starting to happen. So
Yeah.
people is starting to think twice before doing wrong things.
Yeah. Mr. Poit, I want to go with you now because you are an expert in energy, and there are a million questions when it comes to energy that I can ask you, and probably some in the audience, especially those who are visiting us from the Middle East, have. But what I'm going to do is going to be a simple exercise. I'm just going to say a word, and then you say whatever you want to say after I say that word. Petrobras. Go on.
I think this is a good moment in Brazil, high expectation to reduce the size of the government. I think concession of oil and a lot of another privatizations and private-public partnerships will be the key for the reduce the huge size of the government in Brazil. I am very optimistic. I am an entrepreneur from the energy sector whole my life. I sold my company 5 years ago for a world leader in London and work for the government. We have in this moment in Brazil a lot of businessmen helping the government. This is a good signal in a good moment. For example, in the Ministry of Economy, we have political people with experience and a lot of new guys from banks, from good university, and entrepreneurs helping. These people are thinking that the number one goal in Brazil now is the social secure reform. And number two, a huge program of privatization, a part of Petrobras, energy sector, a lot of assets. We have a gold mine in Brazil of companies and the assets bad exploited for the government with a lot of expenses. We need put this in the private sector hands, open the economy, and put all the efforts, all the focus of the government in education, in health, and security. The people that pay taxes help these of the government, not a lot of companies, a lot of size like today. And we have a good environment in this moment for this, because we have three ingredients. We have political wish, we have investor interested, and we are building guarantees for these investments there.
Certainty for investors. Now, would you say that Presidents Luis Inácio Lula da Silva and Dilma Rousseff were wrong when they are expecting too much from Petrobras, perhaps? They were expecting that the company would produce much more than it actually has, and things didn't pan out the way they expected?
I believe in high potential of Petrobras and oil resources in Brazil. But I don't believe in huge companies, big companies with big space for corruption and for bad things there. And thousands of employees, only I have exactly focus in the targets. Then, in my opinion, last President Lula and Dilma, they sought in big companies, not is our thinking in this moment. I think this moment we changed the axles in Brazil for liberalism, open the market, private-public partnerships. We have a big pipeline of privatization, more than 100 companies or part of companies, and a lot of real estate funds, including in the cities. I had worked for the City Hall in São Paulo last 4 years, and we have a gold mine there, hidden of the view of the public. A lot of assets, a lot of companies, and we can privatizations for this and build a good real estate fund. We are building this in this moment, not only in São Paulo City, São Paulo State, but a lot of cities, hundreds of cities in Brazil need reduce the size of the government and more investment on investors.
Let me ask Minister Pio how things have changed since President Bolsonaro took office in terms of the conversations that you're having with world leaders, with investors. How has the conversation changed since Mr. Bolsonaro took office?
I think that one of the things that President Bolsonaro wants is that Brazil becomes a normal country in terms of the economic thinking, how we see that the country can prosper. And we will do that on the same level, taking advantage of the history of other countries that have pursued reasonable policies. I think that the main change is on our side. It's on Brazil accepting that it has to do lots of homework. It has to perfect the governance structure of different companies and the business environment. And so you mentioned Presidents Lula and Dilma in your question to Dr. Poit. And I would like to say that it's a very different mindset that we have now. It's for the first time people saying we have to do the homework. We don't have to ask other countries to help Brazil. Brazil has to do it for itself. And we have to taking advantage of what works. Looking into Dubai, for example, and saying all the perfecting of the government structures, the governing structures in the last 30 to 40 years. It's not rocket science. It's difficult to do politically, but economists, development banks, they have all figured out what are the best incentives for the government to function in ways that will boost private sector investments. We all know that. And so, for the first time, I think that the Brazilian government is taking it into its back and saying, we have to do that. And I think that puts the discussion with world leaders and with the private sector in a very different level. Because you're not talking to a government that says, whatever we do, you have opportunities to invest in Brazil. We'll say, we want more investment, and in order to have that, we want to do the homework. We want to create better guarantees, better institutions, to reduce the possibility of judicialization of investment processes, and to make the justice system work better, to create a better environment to attract all sorts of investment independently of what the ministers and the president thinks that the country should produce. Politicians shouldn't look into the country and say, I want the country to produce A, B, and D, and not C and F. Just, we have to take care of good incentives for productivity to increase and opportunity of investment, private investment to increase in every sector of the economy throughout the huge territory that Brazil has. So that's the change that I see, and we are very confident that will put Brazil in a very different level from what we've been trying to do for the last 6 years. For the last 6 years, we've been saying we are big. You know, we have lots of opportunity. If you want to come, the government will charge you lots of idiosyncratic taxes. Now we want to do tax reform. We want to make it simpler, more rational, and after a little bit, to lower the tax burden. It's for the first time that a Brazilian president or a Brazilian minister of the economy talks about reducing the tax burden, which is crazy. That's what liberals have been telling the whole world for, I don't know, 200 years. And that was not part of the Brazilian discussion, how to reduce the tax burden. And now we have the finance minister under huge recession, out of a huge recession, doing pension reforms, and he talks about a way to start reducing the tax burden, which is new.
Our time together is coming to a close, and I wanted to finish giving each one of you about a minute to say what the best argument, in your opinion, is to convince a foreign investor to take a second look at Brazil. Mr. Minister, let me start with you. Again, about a minute, each of you.
Look, Brazil it's complicated. We have to say that. So, in order to get into Brazil for the first time, look into all the possibilities, hire good consultants, a huge law firm, and it will tell you.
And it's got to be huge.
What's the climate? I'm quite confident that your consultant will say things are getting better faster than we expected. But Brazil has huge opportunities, but we now have a government that approaches our own homework in a different way.
Very good. Mr. Poit.
We are looking hard, the government, in doing business. The index of doing business of the World Bank, probably Brazil will have a good position and a good new position in this index next year, because including the government in cities are working hard to simplify taxes and procedures to open a company in Brazil and reduce taxes and the system of bureaucracy. Brazil is working hard this, has a new position now, and for next year, I think Brazil, I am very optimistic in Brazil. The team of President Bolsonaro is a very good team working hard.
Mr. Baulé, we'll finish with you.
Well, I'm being a businessman for my whole life, so I'll try to put it very pragmatically.
Okay.
The assets in Brazil are overall undervalued, so it's a bargain price to come into Brazil. There's lots of very competent people, so get into Brazil, seek a partnership, as you should do always when you enter a new market. Get somebody that is already there and know how things are.
Mm-hmm.
And the prospects are very good, because when we are in a situation, Brazil is a huge economy, a huge market, so huge potential, and the problem is simpler in the sense that we don't have to make new things. We have to undo bad things we did. And we are committed to that. So I think the prospects are very good for the future.
Senhores, muito obrigado. Thank you very much to all three of you. His Excellency Carlos Pio, Executive Secretary of the Board of Trade and Investment, Ministry of Economy of Brazil. Wilson Poit, Endeavor Entrepreneur and Board Member, Focus Energia in Brazil. And Alexandre Baulé, Founder and Chief Executive Officer of BPAR in Brazil. Let's give it up for these gentlemen. Thank you very much. So what we're going to do now is we're going to take a short break, and we'll be back in about 20 minutes. But the tease is that next we're going to have the Vice President of Panama, Isabel Sermalo de Alvarado, here with us. So don't miss that. We'll see you in about 20 minutes. Thank you very much, everybody. Obrigado. Obrigado. Minister, mucho gusto.